The United States in the Cold War, 1945 to 1953, Chapter 27, Part 3. Now, when FDR died, of course, Harry Truman took over as his term, and he completed the almost 3.5 years. But then he decides he wants to run for re-election and do a full term on his own merits. But he had some pretty strong opponents. Now, Henry Wallace was the vice president of FDR before he was dropped for Mr. Truman. Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, a very staunch racist, segregationist, very popular in the Deep South. Thomas Dewey, the former governor of New York, and he looked a great deal like Clark Gable, as a matter of fact, with his little mustache, but he was the one that's going to cause the most problem, and he threw everything he could at Truman. Well, Truman is not a backstabber. He's not a nasty politician. So he makes speeches from the back of a train, and back in those days, we had little trains going from every little town, and on the back of the train, of course, you had the caboose with a little platform, and they called it whistle stopping, because every time the whistle would blow on the train, they'd stop at a little station, and he'd go back in the back, and the crowd would come to the train station, and he'd make his speech. He ran on his character, which was impeccable. There was not a hint of scandal about this man, other than the fact he was a little bit stubborn sometimes. And he also ran on the issues of keeping people safe and not having to have another war. And he went to bed that night thinking that he'd lost the election because, well, everybody was forecasting Dewey had won. And even the papers, when they came out the next morning, said Dewey had won the election. But they had to recant because it didn't take long for them to figure out they were way out in left field. And if you look at this map, you can see why. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 states in pink. Now, yes, they are some pretty hefty populated states in the Northeast, but those states in the Midwest and on the West Coast, they don't have that many electoral votes. Dewey took New York and Pennsylvania, which are pretty heavy, but then you've got Strom Thurmond in the South, the Deep South. He carried his home state, and he carried the other Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. He didn't carry Georgia. But the majority went to Truman, overwhelmingly, as a matter of fact. Now, FDR had his New Deal, and I'm going to be referring to Mr. Truman as HST, because we did FDR for Roosevelt, so let's do HST for Truman. Truman had his plan, and it was a fair deal, and this is what he presented to Congress. He wanted to extend the New Deal. He wanted to pass a Housing Act, and it was passed in 49, but it didn't work because the Congress didn't fund it. He wanted to revitalize the Social Security program, which he did get that through. He got more benefits for those receiving it, and he also got more people covered. He even proposed a national health insurance. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? The Democrats have been trying to get that since before Truman, as a matter of fact, and it took President Obama to get it too. He wanted to fight racial discrimination because he realized that we were a racist country, but even though the Republicans have control of the Congress, you still have an awful lot of staunch Southern Democrats who are anti-integration, and you've got a lot of Republicans who are very conservative and not too crazy about this idea. He wanted to get a higher minimum wage passed, and he did manage to get another dime put on it, but that was it. But for the most part, Congress rejects his plan. He said it's too socialist, even worse than FDR's New Deal. So he tried, but was unsuccessful. But because of all the racism and segregation, Mr. A. Philip Randolph is leading some pickets again. They can't buy houses. They can't find jobs. He wants something done. So I guess you could say that this is not the beginnings. We've had beginnings back in World War I of the Civil Rights Movement, but they're starting to get a little bit more vocal. Now, right after the war, the United States possessed enormous industrial capacity. We had the largest Navy and Air Force in the world, and the Army was demobilized. And, of course, we had the only atomic bomb in the world. So this kind of made us the most powerful nation on Earth. And while he was alive, Roosevelt had wanted to avoid a return to the isolationism of the post-World War I era, and he believed that the United States should lead efforts to establish cooperation and democracy and prosperity across the globe, and in part through new institutions such as the World Bank and the United Nations. And U.S. leaders believed that our security depended on the stability in Europe and Asia, and that American prosperity required the rebuilding of the economics worldwide. After all, our main source of income is exports, and if people are haven't got any money to buy anything. How are we going to make any money? Of course, the chief obstacle to our leaders' visions for the post-war, it was the communists, the Soviet Union, and their victorious military occupation much of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany, spreading their communist doctrine. So I guess you could say the origins of the Cold War, we've got two superpowers. You've got the United States and you've got the Soviet Union. And both of them had ideas of how to reshape the new world after the war in their own image. We knew that the Soviets were too weak to threaten us, but we did recognize that their intention to dominate Eastern Europe and spread that devilish communism. So when we got requests from the Soviets for some aid, the paperwork kind of got mislaid. And since Russia had been so totally hit by the German army, I mean, they were just devastated. They weren't that much industrialized to begin with, but the war just wiped out everything. So for her own peace of mind and to rebuild her own economy, she started taking the industrial equipment out of the occupied zones that she had. That she strip pressed Germany totally. I mean, East Germany. It was just terrible the way she took everything. And in reality, a lot of it had to do with personalities and doctrines from post-war. Russia was very insecure over what they perceived as an aggressive United States, and the United States was irrational in our fears of communism. And we knew that this wartime alliance was not going to last. We'd formed an alliance only to defeat Hitler. So clashes between the U.S. and Soviets, they're bound to resurface. And in all honesty, the first event occurred in the Middle East when the Soviet troops occupied parts of northern Iran and their rich oil fields. Well, Great Britain and the United States, they pressured the Soviets, and they did withdraw their troops. But then they turned right around and installed, I use the word loosely, installed a pro-communist government in Poland and Romania and Bulgaria. And they said, how could we say anything after all we dominated, Latin America? But Bernard Baruch, very influential man, very smart man when it comes to money. He was a presidential advisor to both FDR and to Truman. And he called the conflict between the United States and Soviets a Cold War. And of course, the newspapers always loved catchphrases, so they picked it up, and from then on, it was known as the Cold War. And in a speech in Missouri, former Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain had fallen over Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. That should be had, not hand. I apologize for that. Yeah, it wasn't a real curtain. It wasn't a real wall. We didn't have the Berlin Wall yet. It was just, sometimes there would be fences across border crossings, but for the most part, it was figuratively on paper rather than in reality. But it was very definite division. George Kennan, one of our most smart diplomats, he spoke Russian fluently. He understood the Russian culture. He was a great person to have as a diplomat to Russia. And he spent some time over there. Then he informed the president that the communist ideology made their government permanently aggressive. There was no way around it. And we're the only country that can check any attempts to expand their power. Well, that kind of puts you between a rock and a hard place. You got to either or get off the pot. But we had made attempts to stabilize war-torn Europe. We joined the United Nations, which we hadn't joined before. The International Monetary Fund stabilized the national currencies. The World Bank made loans with money from the member nations of the United Nations. But the U.S. is dominating and dictating the economic policies of these newly developing nations. And then we requested at the persuasion of Mr. Baruch to get the United Nations to regulate atomic research and to inspect production sites. Well, this was going to go over like something bad in a punch bowl, because nobody who wants to build up their own atomic weapon research is going to want anyone over there looking at them. And we're having that problem right now with a few countries. When FDR had become vice president in 1944, he was an obscure senator from Missouri with very little foreign policy experience. And when he became president, he faced some daunting foreign policy challenges. He didn't trust Stalin. And he truly believed that the United States had to assume world leadership. So he decided to embrace a policy called containment. Britain had signaled that they could no longer aid a communist-led fight against a communist-led revolt in Turkey and Greece, and something had to be done because it was like dominoes. Once Turkey and Greece fell, the entire Mediterranean would fall. Well, we decided to join them. And what happened is, basically, Truman drew a line in the sand saying no further expansion of communism. And basically, where you are right now is as far as you're going to go. And he'd also been warned by his advisors that he's going to frighten the American people to get the support. But this policy of containment, called the Truman Doctrine, is going to commit us to the responsibility to support any country who's anti-communist and who wants to fight the communists. And to help us along, we established some security agencies, the National Security Council, which would meet and advise the president, and the Central Intelligence Agency. See, we didn't have that before the late 1940s. And that one little line removed from congressional oversight. Yeah. The Marshall Plan was also another way. I mean, other than fighting and having the United Nations, we have another one because we were smart enough to realize that all the destruction caused by the war, the food scarcity and inflation, it's plaguing the European continent. And anytime you're hungry and you're very susceptible to messages. And with this crisis going on, it made them, well, kind of look favorably toward the Communist Party, who promised things better, especially in France and Italy. So the Marshall Plan, I think the best analogy is it's kind of a New Deal for Europe. And we're not going to just give them something to eat. Like the man says, you don't just give a man a fish, you teach him how to fish. And that's basically what we did. We helped them rebuild their factories. We got them tractors. We taught them how to maintain the tractors and how to maintain their equipment. And once we do this, Europe's going to have a mass industrial complex. And once these people have jobs and have some money, they're going to want to buy stuff from us. It didn't take very long, and in a very few years, production in Europe exceeded their pre-war levels because of our help. But Russia said, no, niet. They refused to support the plan. And it's going to cause even more tension between the Soviet Union and the U.S. But 23 nations, which include the U.S., created something called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT. And it's supposed to foster free trade between the countries and create larger markets for our American goods and investments, as well as trading between the countries. Meanwhile, Japan's recovery plan. General Douglas MacArthur, oh, bless his old sweet stinky heart. Him and his corncob pipe. He was put in control of the, what do you want to call it, the recovery of Japan. He acted as a dictator. Nothing happened over there that he didn't have his fingers in the pie. But he did get them to enact a very democratic constitution. He got them to enact land reform. He got them to let women have the vote. Of course, he made Japan to promise never to go to war again. And they were only allowed to maintain a very small army, and that was strictly for self-defense. And of course, we supervised the economic recovery. And first they decided they were going to get rid of all the giant industrial corporations that kind of enabled the Japanese aggression. But the policymakers in the U.S. decided that, a strong Japanese economy is not only going to help us because it's more markets for us, but it's also going to deter communism and maybe act as a check of communism in Asia. So we supervised their economic recovery, as I said, and doing things our way. It wouldn't take long. In less than 5 years after the war ended, Japan's economy is booming. And whereas prior to the war, you wouldn't want to buy anything from Japan because it was sleazy, you wanted the German stuff, now you want the Japanese stuff. And I will admit, I drive a Japanese car and have a Japanese TV. I also lived over there for almost 4 years. Now, Russia was very defensive with all these U.S. plans. And her response was, well, the Hungarian communists at the, shall we say, encouragement from Soviets expelled all other political parties other than the Communist Party. In Bulgaria, they even went one step further. If you didn't go along with the Communist Party, you were just executed. And Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary, taking a look at what's going on in Bulgaria, well, we better sign a defense pact with the Soviets. Let's be buddy-buddies. February 1948, the communists took over Czechoslovakia. And you could do a whole semester on that particular vote. We just sat back and let it happen. A few months later, they had been listening to the French and the British and the English because when at the end of the war, Germany was divided into 4 sections: Japanese, not Japanese, but Russian, American, British, and France. And they also divided Berlin's capital into 4 sections. Each of the big four had a section. The problem is that Berlin, the capital city, is way inside the Russian sector. So you have to go through the Russian sector to get to your sector of Berlin. And since we'd been talking and things have been going so well, just within a few years, the English and the French and the Americans were about ready to turn control of their sectors back over to the German people. And the Soviets, of course, didn't want this to happen. The last thing they wanted was a united Germany. So they stopped all traffic from coming through the Russian sector to even get to Berlin. Like I said, the real reason where plans were being made to turn the control back to the German people. The West German economy and West Berlin economies were going gangbusters. But what's your alternative? You want to go to war with the Soviets because you can't go down their road? Or are you going to abandon 2.5 million people who live in Berlin and all the military there? And of course, our solution was rather unique in world history. And of course, the Berlin Blockade is what it's called. It's explained very well in your YouTube. We began to fly stuff in, airlift. And an 11-month airlift supply to West Berlin, and it eventually was ended. This is just a picture of some of they had to take everything from coal and cotton and foodstuffs and medical supplies. And this is something coming in out of the French port, because I mean they were all in on it. And here you've got a picture of the American children waving at the planes, because I think they were landing like a plane every 90 seconds or something in Berlin. We were running out of it. We're taking a chance. I mean, Germany, or not Germany, but Russia could have shot at our planes, but she didn't. And we have had some, well, historical debates over this. President Truman kind of ran a bluff. It's going on and on and on, and it's very expensive because, I mean, you got all these countries where it's just been a humongous effort. And all of a sudden, President Truman orders a whole company of bombers to England and let it be known that they were coming. We leaked the information. And these bombers that were sent over to Germany were the exact same bombers that had gone over Japan and dropped the atomic bomb. So the atomic bomb was not mentioned. But all of a sudden, we had several dozen planes over there who had the ability to drop atomic bombs. So I guess you'd say he ran a bluff, and Stalin blinked. In April of 1949, 12 nations got together and signed a mutual defense treaty, which was very unusual for us because we'd never wanted to get involved in overseas people's business. It became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which is still around today, by the way. The Soviet Union, of course, responded, well, we can't have this, because she felt very isolated. And so she responded with something called the Warsaw Pact, which was a mutual defense treaty for all of her satellites, the people that she was controlling. Now, I want you to watch the 2 YouTubes, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, that explains it much better than I have, and a little YouTube about Berlin Blockade. And then next week, we will take up 1949 and 1950 and 51 are very, very busy, controversial years, and we will finish this chapter next lesson.